Not much is known about the early years of Dorothy Ruth Hugh Stratten before her rise to fame. She was born on the 20th of February 1960 in Vancouver, Canada to Dutch immigrant parents Simon and Nellie Hugh Stratten. While barely having enough financially to make ends meet, they would go on to have two children together, Dorothy, then John, born in 1961. When she was only 3, her father would desert the family, which left them even more financially destitute, with Nellie having to take on the full responsibility of care for 2 growing children on her own, including a third child, Louise, born in 1968, from an affair with her employer while she worked as a housekeeper. Dorothy rarely saw her father after his abandonment, and their relationship remained non-existent. Being the oldest child, Dorothy would have to grow up quickly to support her mother and the upbringing of her siblings, especially while Nellie took on odd jobs as she trained to become a nurse, primarily relying on the sustenance of social assistance, sowing seeds of desire in Dorothy to get as far away in later years from her difficult upbringing as possible in pursuit of bigger dreams. They lived in a rough working-class neighborhood in Vancouver, where Dorothy attended Centennial High School in Coquitlam. Dorothy would describe her teenage self as plain with big hands. Amongst her peers, she hardly stood out, yet was often recognized as shy, pleasant, sensible, going through the motions of school and home life like any average high schooler. She most preferred her own company, retreating into her room for hours. At 16, she developed an ulcer, perhaps aggravated by a smoking habit at 13. She loved to write and the language of poetry, externalizing her thoughts and feelings within scribbled lines of prose, on paper scraps, receipts, textbooks, even gifting them to her friends as tokens of sentimentality. At 14, she took on a part-time job at a local Dairy Queen, handing over the bulk of her paycheck to her mom, who already worked tirelessly herself to make ends meet as a school cafeteria server. It was great to get work that young, she would later write, but I turned 15 and 16 and 17, and at 18 I was still working there, wearing a little red uniform. About a month before her 18th birthday, she broke up with her first boyfriend Steve on New Year's weekend after he destroyed the Christmas present it had taken her months to pay for in a fit of jealous rage. They'd been dating for about a year, but she described their relationship as beneficially one-sided, and Steve as brutish, often selfishly imposing his will upon her, regardless of her wants or needs, so she was relieved to be rid of him. Months prior to her 18th birthday in later 1977, 26-year-old Paul Leslie Snider visited Dorothy's Dairy Queen branch for the first time and ordered a strawberry sundae supreme. In many ways, Snider's childhood bore many similarities to Dorothy's. He also grew up in a tough area within Vancouver's East End, surrounded by gang activity and machismo. His home life was also rife with instability, and his parents going separate ways when he was only a boy. Steeped in poverty, which likely influenced his later ambitions, he had to fend for himself after he quit school in the 7th grade. In his later teens, he took up bodybuilding to end the constant teasing from peers due to his naturally skinny, scrawny build. After a year of visible change in his physique, he soon became more confident and popular with the opposite sex, particularly the women in the nightclub circuit who found his exceptionally groomed look quite attractive. For a time, Snider saw some success as a promoter of automobile and motorcycle shows at the Pacific National Exhibition, but the two things it seemed he could never get enough of were women and money. So when legal enterprises failed to adequately support his extravagant taste and lifestyle, he sought out other means. Around town, he became known as a Jewish pimp. Wearing mink, cruising in a black Corvette in his signature combed-back dark hair and manicured mustache, flaunting a bejeweled Star of David around his neck. Yet the local Vancouver gangs regarded him with scorn. He never touched drugs, disclosed a Rounder gang member. Nobody trusted him that much, and he was scared to death of drugs. He finally lost a lot of money to loan sharks, and a Rounder crowd hung him by his ankles from the 30th floor of a hotel. He had to leave town. Snider took shelter in Los Angeles, where he immediately put his girls to work on the outskirts of Beverly Hills, styling them in classic Hollywood pin-up glamour, eventually seeing enough success to acquire a gold-tone limousine. But deep down he felt he deserved even more, nurturing the fantasy of becoming a Hollywood star on the big screen, perhaps even a director director or producer. Yet try as he might, he never could pry himself into elite circles within the Hollywood industry who looked down on him as nothing more than a cheap hustler. The pimping trade soon wore him out as costs began to outweigh the benefits. One of his girls took off with some of his valuables, and he often had close calls with the law. Snider was terrified of going to jail. He once told the girl he would take his own life instead. When he returned to Vancouver in 1977, he committed himself to staying on the straight and narrow, but there was Dorothy. Taken by her looks upon meeting her for the first time in an East Vancouver Dairy Queen and with the keen eye of a pimp, Snider was said to have turned to his accompanying friend and said, "That girl could make me a lot of money." He got Dorothy's number from a fellow waitress and kept in contact with her over the phone. It didn't take long for Snider to win Dorothy over. With the 9-year age gap between them, Snider was not only more experienced but also street smart. He took on an almost paternalistic position in her life which until then had been completely empty. Never having had enough money to afford nice things throughout her life, Snider showered her with lavish gifts, stylish clothes donned by the perfectly manicured girls in magazine covers, a topaz ring set with diamonds and other offerings. She had been used to a life burdened with the responsibilities of an eldest daughter for as long as she could remember, never really having much personal space or autonomy. With Snider, she could escape to his luxury apartments with skylights and plush interiors, burgundy leather furniture, wide open spaces, and manicured plants. There, he'd show off his cooking skills as he made dinner, while pouring out a bottle of wine from his collection. Afterwards, he'd play his guitar while she sipped on a cocktail. He showered her with affection and compliments, pointed out her comely features which no one else ever noticed, infected her with his confidence and ambitions as she glowed from within. At the local night spots, people treated Snider like a celebrity, and she felt privileged to be by his side. She felt seen for the very first time. It wasn't like with her first boyfriend, riddled with boyish insecurities, which he often blamed her for, nor the boys or men who shouted out crude comments as she passed by them on the streets. She wrote in her diary, "If you don't know what love is, how are you supposed to know when you're in love?" But against Snider's charm, she stood very little chance. Nellie, her mother, on the other hand, wasn't so taken with Snider and advised Dorothy against him. But Dorothy was reluctant to accept advice from someone who hadn't had much success in the area of love and romance. Her father had run off. Her stepdad, Nellie's second husband, and subsequent boyfriends who came and went never fostered good relations with her or her siblings and were often unkind or simply disinterested in them, sometimes even physically violent. One had left her brother John with a broken arm and Dorothy a bloodied nose. Snider knew how to work Nellie's disapproval to his advantage, painting a picture of their relationship as some fairy tale forbidden romance where it was them against the world, drawing Dorothy even closer. Snider was never violent with her, not at first. In public and to the outside world, he was an obnoxious, loudmouth show-off. But when it was just them two, Snider showcased the romantic side of a warm, vulnerable Jewish boy, which made her feel so special. Dorothy had no idea that on the streets, Snider was nicknamed the Jewish pimp, or that for over a decade he had dealt in drugs and prostitution, fine-tuning the skill of manipulating naive young women. Snider tentatively soon started trying to convince Dorothy to pose nude for Playboy, but every time he brought it up, she hesitated. At times, he managed to secure retired bunnies and playmates to work in his auto shows and witnessed how trauma and addictions had left them burnt out beyond recognition. To break into the industry, he tried to promote average girls who worked under him as playmates without much success. Yet, with Dorothy, he saw something in her that the other girls did not possess, pedestalizing her as some class merchandise. With her 18th birthday drawing closer, his talk of Playboy increased from a monthly to weekly basis, as well as his love-bombing efforts. Lavish gifts, romantic prose, luxurious getaway retreats. For her graduation ceremony, he bought her a lovely white ruffle dress and escorted her to her high school dance. There, he met the German photographer Hugh Hefner, responsible for taking her graduation photo. A month later, his lucky opening arrived when Dorothy's mother went away for a 3-week trip to Europe. He called Hugh and made a bargain that if he could help convince Dorothy to strip for Playboy, the $1,000 finder's fee would be his to keep. Dorothy, on the other hand, was told they would simply be taking couple photos at Hugh's apartment, but halfway through the shoot, Snider stripped down to his shorts and jokingly posed for several exaggerated muscle man shots. Amidst the laughter and friendly banter, Hugh and Snider playfully encouraged her to take her clothes off too. "Do it for me," Snider begged as Dorothy pushed back nervously, on the verge of tears. "Please do it for me." And so she did. She was eager to please, recalled Hugh. I hesitated to rearrange her breasts, thinking it might upset her, but she said, "Do whatever you like." Hugh would never get his cut of the finder's fee since Snider was hardly a man of his word, but his work was enough to capture the eye of Vancouver photographer Ken Honey, who had successfully sent several Canadian girls to Playboy. His only caveat was Dorothy was underage and would need a parental signature on her application to make it legal. Dorothy was too reluctant to tell anyone back home about the nude photos, so Snider returned to Ken with Nellie's signature successfully forged on the documents. And that was that. Ken knew he had found a girl Hefner was likely to take great interest in. They scheduled a shoot at Snider's apartment. A timid Dorothy did her best to follow his directions. The photos were sent overnight to Los Angeles. Playboy VP Marilyn Grabowski, who had an eye for Hefner's preferences, instantly took the photos to him. Less than 48 hours after he saw the photos, Dorothy was at the Playboy mansion located at 10236 Charing Cross Road in Holmby Hills, California. The contest had been a laborious one, with several young women around the country sending in their best work, hoping to be chosen. But none could measure up to Hefner's perfect fantasy, modeled after the title character in Little Annie Fanny, Playboy's long-running cartoon serial. Oklahoma candidate Candy Lovin had been at the forefront of the race, but she was brunette, married, and in her early 20s, which was less than ideal for Hefner, who wanted the 25th anniversary winner for himself. Miss Lovin was already spoken for. Snider was enraged when he discovered Playboy only provided one round-trip ticket to Los Angeles and none for him, her chaperone. But he directed her to lie to the supervisor at the telephone company she was working at as a clerk typist that she needed to leave immediately due to a family emergency. Her flight was scheduled to LA International for the 13th of August 1978, the first flight she had ever been on, and later picked up in her first ever limousine ride to the Playboy mansion on Sunset Strip. Dorothy described her wide-eyed first meeting with Hefner and Patrick Curtis, saying, "I thought my knees were going to go out from under me," all the while sipping on the glass of white wine she'd been given as she tried to calm her nerves and drown out Snider's skillfully worded parting message, that she might have to sleep with Hefner to win the competition, but he would understand and hold no grudge as long as she came back to him. PJ Mastin, who worked with Playboy from 1972 to 82, also corroborated the setup on the Secrets of Playboy TV series, saying, "In order to get Playmate of the Year, you had to do some pretty wild things up in the bedroom with Hef and his friends. You had to vie for that position." After the initial introductory weekend was spent, Playboy said they still needed her for an extra 3 to 4 days. She quickly returned to Vancouver in a desperate effort to save her job at BC Telephone and continued the lie that she needed a couple extra weeks off for family issues, then told her siblings, as Nellie was still away in Europe, that she would be gone for a while as she had secured a modeling job in LA. In her unfinished memoir, she wrote, "My visit extended to 3 weeks. Paul was getting more and more nervous every day. He would call the photographer in Vancouver and yell at him. He would call the photographer in LA and ask him questions. He called the studio and he called the mansion 3 to 4 times a day. He couldn't figure out why I was staying for so long. Sometimes I cried before I went to sleep. A lot of men were entering my life all of a sudden. No one was ever pushy or forceful, but talk can be powerful." She often escaped to producer Patrick Curtis's home to stay when the coercions at the mansion from both men and women got too intense to navigate. The pressures of her environment were overwhelming to the point where she admitted to falling into a deeply depressive state. Many women who previously worked with Playboy, whether in its corporate office or in front of the camera, detail stories of violent and covert sexual assault cases. Lisa Lovin Barrett, Hefner's executive assistant in the late 70s, alleged the same underlying sense of sexual entitlement was commonplace. "I work with a man in silk pajamas," she said. That automatically lended itself to a degree of casualness that you would never experience in any other office atmosphere. You know, it was nothing to be loading the Xerox machine and have someone come up and grind you from behind. 1973 Playmate of the Month Mickey Garcia, who worked her way up to become the brand's director of promotions, confessed in an interview, "There is always a situation where you become powerless. Somebody comes in and they can do whatever they want with you because in their mind, they're living this fantasy of what Hefner projected." Garcia also alleged that she was raped by a very popular actor on a very well-known series when they were both hired by Playboy to attend an auto show. He laughed at her when she threatened to call the police, as they would be more likely to believe him over her. Not wanting to become a problem to the brand, she had to return to work in collaboration with her rapist for the entire next day. By the end of October, Snider had permanently moved into a modest apartment in West LA to be closer to her, perhaps in an attempt to permanently secure his place in her life and maintain control. He proposed and she said yes. At the Playboy Halloween costume party that month, where he was her +1, he stuck out like a sore thumb. Writer and producer Peter Bogdanovich, who hung out often at the Playboy mansion and had been introduced to Dorothy around this time, wrote, "Hefner, Curtis, and everyone else at the mansion hated him on sight, though they spoke pleasantly enough to his face. The dress and manner of the street pimp conflicted harshly with the mansion's classier-looking clientele. Hefner looked older than I'd ever seen him and more dispirited. His dream girl preferred a petty racketeer from the streets." It became more and more apparent that Dorothy was unhappy in their relationship. While she pushed through grueling hours at the Playboy Club, yet still managed to wake up early enough the next day for her fitness sessions, Snider slept in till afternoon, then spent the rest of the day sat on the sofa watching TV. Resentment towards him grew as she attempted modeling gigs at more reputable agencies, but was turned down time and time again due to the nude Playboy shoot he'd pressured her into, a mark against her reputation. She was well and truly stuck, and every excuse she found to be out of the apartment and away from Snider, she took. When friends asked why she still continued to stay with him, she admitted she felt she owed him something, though not entirely sure what. Snider at this point was living off her financially and used the secrets she confided in him of awkward encounters at the club, particularly with Hefner, as a guilt-inducing slight against her, like something she needed to make up to him for. To break her down even further and make her submit, Hefner's demands on Dorothy only grew as he continued to request more and more explicit poses of her by his camera crew, which he would project across the giant TV screens in his bedroom. Despite her tears on set, Playboy centerfold's photographer Mario Casilli would do his best to meet Hefner's demands. A number of other sympathetic staff at Playboy advised Dorothy that lack of compliance with Hefner could cost her the Playmate of the Year competition. According to Sandra Theodore, who dated Hefner from 1976 to 1981, Hefner allegedly had a skeleton key that opened every door at the mansion, and he took advantage of this access. "I didn't know what to do. She kept saying no," Theodore tearfully recalled. "He forced himself on her. I was standing there and I was terrified. All these years, does she still think I'm a monster because of it? I'm sorry I didn't do anything to stop it." Hef said to me, "Well, did they think they were going to come and stay in my house and not sleep with me?" Whether they consented or not, if he wanted something, he would take it. Many of his victims, she believes, stayed silent due to the incriminating tapes he kept of them. In her personal life, her relationship with Snider continued to grow more strained due to jealousy and issues with control. Constant anxiety led to considerable weight loss and illnesses, which didn't go unnoticed by Hefner. Playboy eventually decided she was not ready to hold the 25th anniversary Playmate title and chose Candy Lovin instead. Unlike Lovin, Dorothy's press experience needed improvement, they said, as well as her media charisma. In the meantime, she was named Playmate of the Month in August 1979 and featured in that month's magazine centerfold. When Snider heard Dorothy would be named Playmate of the Month in the August issue, he insisted they get married before the issue released. By this time, her career and fame was on the up and up. She often rubbed shoulders with big names in the industry through her affiliations with Playboy. TV and movie offers were trickling in, and it seemed his efforts in her were promising big rewards. She started taking acting classes and landed small TV appearances, like an episode on Fantasy Island, Americathon, Skate Town USA, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, Galaxina. His marriage to her would also ensure that he could legally reside in the US. On the 1st of June 1979, they were married at a small ceremony in LA. A longtime ally in the drug trade was his best man, and another stood in as Dorothy's father and walked her down the aisle. She wouldn't inform her family of their marriage for weeks. Melancholy set in during what should have been a blissful honeymoon phase as life became a monotonous despair. Canadian film Autumn Born was released that year, her first film and leading role, in which she perhaps ironically played a confident young woman who was kidnapped by a brainwashing institution where she was beaten, starved, sexually assaulted, and tortured into submission, after which her torture still continued. It lacked plot or theme, and with a low budget had a very amateurish look. A friend from Playboy recommended an agent to facilitate her career progression, but that fell through as the agent unprofessionally made passes at her. When she tried to secure a lawyer to help with contracts and other necessary legal procedures, he boldly tried to physically assault her in his office, chasing her around his desk while taking his pants off. Several men presented themselves as harmless friends at first, only to turn spiteful when their advances were rejected. Her role with Playboy also had its demands on her time and put her in situations which she wasn't always comfortable with, but she still needed them to remain and work in the US legally. Oftentimes she would cry on set if she was pushed too hard into poses which made her feel too exposed. Hate, she later confided in Peter Bogdanovich when he asked her how she managed to make it through the shoots. I mean that I hated all those men so much, and my hatred was so strong, it made an invincible shield between them and me, and I didn't feel so naked anymore. The hate was protecting me. Snider was always plotting and failing at his grand business schemes, often involving her, his main investment, a Playmate of the Month signature perfume, a cosmetic line, a biography of her life, a collaboration with Daredevil Evil Knievel for a motorcycle stunt, a Farrah Fawcett look-alike contest, a male strip club for women. Dorothy was his only successful project, yet he continued obvious affairs and flirtations with other women within her industry, and even as near as her close friendship circle. To one of such targets, Molly Bassler, Dorothy would confide that even after their marriage, she only found Snider more and more repulsive. 6 months beforehand, Hefner announced Dorothy would be chosen as the 1980 Playmate of the Year. This would not be made public till April. Photographer Cassili was already fine-tuning an image of her reminiscent of a full glamour Marilyn Monroe. She would receive a $200,000 cash prize, a car, jewelry, and other trinkets, plus a puppy Hefner personally picked out and named after himself, Marston, his middle name. A puppy Snider would go on to poison and kill out of spite. The start of that year brought with it many handlers to exalt her into her new level of fame. More photographers, fitness trainers, acting coaches, promoters, agents, and managers, all of which triggered Snider into lobbying for more control over her life and specifically finances in order to not be replaced and pushed out altogether. In January, her minor role in They All Laughed, a picture by Peter Bogdanovich starring Audrey Hepburn and Ben Gazzara, was announced. Filming was set to begin in March, and it would serve as an escape from Snider, as Bogdanovich insisted outsiders were not allowed on set, so Snider would not be able to accompany her. Bogdanovich, 41 at the time, meant he was over twice her own age, at 19 going on 20. Their affair quickly developed even before they arrived on set, yet remained a closely guarded secret. Most of the crew described him as a selfish megalomaniac, but the cast mostly found him quite charming. A crew member revealed they weren't hanging all over each other. It wasn't until the last few weeks when everyone relaxed for a bit that they would show up together holding hands. Snider, who kept tabs on her while they were apart, couldn't help but notice the growing iciness in her tone whenever they spoke, the more and more excuses not to talk. Too busy, too sleepy after a long day. No responses to his I love yous before she ended the call. From Montreal, she wrote to him asking for freedom, accusing him of being too controlling and smothering, but he responded with rage. When the shoot break in April came along after she was announced as Playmate of the Year on the 30th, she agreed to meet up with Snider in Los Angeles, but he turned up anyway in Vancouver where she was visiting to attend her mother's wedding amidst several press meetings like the Johnny Carson show and Playboy luncheons. Her team at Playboy, well aware of Snider's irrational outbursts and the deflating effects it had on Dorothy, were concerned about their planned meeting and had offered to arrange security to accompany her so she wouldn't have to be alone with him, but she refused. Bogdanovich's account of the event in his book, The Killing of the Unicorn, reads, "They were in a hotel in Vancouver. Snider was downstairs. She could see him down at the pool. He had bullied her, she said, and threatened to leave, go to Hawaii and never speak to her again. Good, I said. Let him go." But Dorothy was frightened. She said she didn't know why. She was afraid to let him leave in such anger. She wanted to be his friend. He had been responsible for her success. Snider checked into her hotel room against her will, where they argued constantly. He insisted on her look for the wedding ceremony, a flashy gold mini dress with a plunging neckline, gold spiked heels, more makeup than she would typically wear, and her hair in voluptuous curls. Bogdanovich described it as a Las Vegas hooker outfit. She stuck out like a sore thumb and looked visibly uncomfortable. Her mother Nellie had to give her a shawl to cover the front of her dress, which Dorothy wrapped permanently around herself throughout the whole procession. He marched her from venue to venue at the nightclub district and pocketed under the table the payment he negotiated with event and club owners for bringing along a Playboy bunny and film star to their establishments, fired up by the attention she brought him. To a friend, Dorothy later confided that she had offered to leave Hollywood and everything in it behind and return to Vancouver to live a simple life with Snider, but he didn't want that either. Snider could see his ticket to wealth and fame slipping from his fingers, a growing fear that it was only a matter of time till he would be cut off completely. The tricks he had played on the small-town ice cream shop girl seemed silly and even pathetic now to a growing star. Legally, he was still entitled to half the assets she had acquired during their marriage, but how much could he really get out of her if those assets were being protected by her corporation, Dorothy Stratten Enterprises? Who had even given her that idea anyway? How did a former Dairy Queen store attendant come to know so much about financial settlements and assets protection? When she talked to him now, it felt like she was reading from a script, parroting lines from more seasoned advisors. It wasn't long before his fears became reality, when he received documents in June communicating he and Dorothy's relational and financial separation, as well as the closure of their joint bank accounts. All future payments were to be made by her business manager. He'd already cleared $15,000 from their joint accounts before its closure, but upon receiving their separation documents, he took one of his girlfriends at the time to the bank and tried to present the lookalike as Dorothy in order to gain access to her personal bank accounts, but the bank security checks proved too difficult. Snider was a hustler, so he could always float without her. Over the years, he'd acquired a number of unrelated skills which could be put to use into diverse schemes, but somehow he always managed to mess it up. Whether it was due to his desire to get things done too quickly and avoid the slow grind, to evade any law which stood in his way, to selfishly use others for his own gain, then discard them after he'd sucked them dry, to cheat, to exaggerate, to deceive. Besides, the heights he'd reached through Dorothy now made just getting by feel like a death sentence. First, he took a stab at hitting the jackpot a second time when he met 17-year-old checkout girl Patty at an auto show in Riverside where she modeled part-time. They moved into the same shell of an apartment he and Dorothy once shared. Patty was an almost physical carbon copy of Dorothy, and so he slowly groomed her to dress like Dorothy, dye her hair even blonder, and manipulate it into the same curls like her, walk like her, talk like her. But his hopes were deflated when after he tried to market her to Playboy in the same way he'd done with Dorothy, he was very sternly rejected. The straw that broke the camel's back came when Snider attempted to milk his association with Dorothy for one last big cash out. About a month before they were married, they'd collaborated with photographer couple Bill and Susan LaChase to capture shots of Dorothy in skating gear, reminiscent of her appearance in Skate Town. If they could print 1 million posters, it would net at least $300,000 in returns. But Dorothy had dropped out of the deal due to other engagements at the time. The couple now flew to New York where Dorothy still was, even though shooting had by then ended, in an attempt to make her reconsider. At the production office, they were directed to Peter Bogdanovich's plaza where she was staying. It was 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the couple later recounted. There had been a cast party the night before. Dorothy answered the door in pajamas. She looked at the photos in the hallway, and we could tell by her eyes that she liked them. She took them inside. Somebody in there was telling her what to do. Despite her initial reception, Dorothy returned to the couple waiting in the hallway and rejected the deal yet again. When they phoned Bogdanovich's plaza the following week, the receptionist's tone on the line was less than friendly. "We don't know Dorothy Stratten. Stop harassing us." The fine details of this meeting must have gotten back to Snider. Why was Dorothy living in her recent director's home? Were they having an affair? And for how long? Was Bogdanovich the agent behind their breakup? Snider's next move was to hire a private detective, 26-year-old freelancer Mark Goldstein, who had been recommended by a trusted third party. One of Snider's lawyers claimed his plan was to document tangible proof of the affair and sue Bogdanovich for enticement to breach management contract, as if his marriage to Dorothy was a business venture and she his product whom Bogdanovich had poached. Goldstein became a regular onlooker of Bogdanovich's plaza, while Snider ransacked Dorothy's leftover possessions in the home they used to share. He gathered the love letters and poems he found from his rival, hidden amongst her belongings, and set about getting proof to support his illusion that Bogdanovich gained control over Dorothy by feeding her with hard drugs, specifically cocaine. Yet, beneath his desperate grab for power, he knew his efforts would be in vain. How could he fund a legal battle against an accomplished and more financially capable personality like Bogdanovich? Even Dorothy herself was cladded behind a solid barrier of lawyers. To a friend, he confided in a brief moment of honest vulnerability, "Maybe this thing is too big for me," as he seriously considered just going back to Vancouver. But defeat was too humiliating to accept. During this period, Bill LaChase revealed Snider called him one night in tears, wailing over having no access to Dorothy. His housemates returned home to find him on the living room floor in a out, barely responsive state. Several drafts of letters to her were written but discarded. He even penned one to Bogdanovich, claiming that if he let go of Dorothy and disappeared from their lives, he would find it in him to forgive and not take any action against him, though it is not clear if this letter was ever posted. He also blamed Hefner for inciting the affair by introducing the two and called the mansion in an attempt to guilt-trip an invitation out of them to Hefner's Midsummer Night's Dream party on August the 1st, but they refused, saying he would only be able to attend as Dorothy's +1. Dorothy never showed up to this event anyway. Both she and Bogdanovich preferred to keep a low profile in order to not incite rumors about their budding relationship, which could take attention away from the film's release. Instead, she had quietly moved into Bogdanovich's home at the Bel Air estate, where many power players in the Hollywood industry resided, only making appearances in Dallas and Houston for Playboy promotions. Snider would confide to one of his girlfriends that later that same night of the party, he parked his Mercedes across Sunset from Bel Air and hid in the bushes by Bogdanovich's gate, from where he had a clear view of the entrance, a loaded gun he'd borrowed from a friend in his tight grip. Perhaps it was the cocaine he'd become so dependent on that fueled this boldness. After several hours with no sign of anyone coming in or out, he walked back to his car, drove to Mulholland Drive, and seethed in silence while he contemplated simply taking his own life. Dorothy, on the other hand, was visibly glowing with success and the steady acceleration of her career. Lawrence Schiller had approached her to play Marilyn Monroe in his upcoming TV movie, which she had declined, to star in They All Laughed instead. Charlie's Angels had considered her for a role, but her manager thought she could do even better than that. Vogue and Harper's Bazaar wanted fashion layouts of her to be timed with the release of her new picture. Johnny Casablanca's agency, Elite, who had just signed Patty Hansen, the top model of the country at the time, were set to take Dorothy on also, with her Playboy term expiring soon. Producer Marty Krofft had scheduled a meeting with her to discuss an offer for his new film The Last Desperado, yet despite the outward glitz and glamour, close confidence disclosed that she would often cry in private, still grieving her breakup with Snider, and perhaps even harboring feelings of guilt, which she soothed by making plans to see to it that he would be financially taken care of, even after the divorce. From Houston, she called him and agreed to meet in person on Friday, the 8th of August, for lunch. To Snider, her call was the only light in the darkness of his immediate life and set in motion exaggerated fantasies on the outcome of their meeting. Friends described him as giddy when he went out for sandwiches with them the night before their date. "I've got to vacuum the rug," he'd said. "The Queen is coming back." His expectations, however, gave way to colossal disappointment at the realization that Dorothy was on a completely different page as she sat across from him on the apartment couch and confessed that she was in love with Bogdanovich, but was prepared to make sure he was properly financially settled. The rest was a blur as she ransacked the closet for clothes she wanted and offered the rest, perhaps as an attempt towards peacekeeping, to her work-in-progress clone Patty. The plummet was devastating. Witnesses who saw him afterwards during the following 5 days leading to the tragedy stated he had been acting very odd. An obsession for acquiring a gun by any means had taken hold. During a Sunday barbecue he held for friends, he pulled Mark Goldstein aside and desperately asked him for help in buying a machine gun for home protection, but Goldstein advised that it would be excessive. Snider would eventually come across an ad for a 2-gauge Mossberg pump shotgun in the San Fernando Valley area. He called for more details, then drove up to the construction site meeting place of the sale on a Wednesday, where he was shown how to load and fire his new weapon. Friends stated Snider was in a jovial mood when he returned home that evening, excitedly telling a neighbor Dorothy would be dropping by the next day so they could go look at a property he'd advised her to purchase as an investment. He even dropped by the La Chase studio to inspect promotional shots they'd taken for Patty, then stayed longer for a chat which in retrospect contained a lot of alarming clues, but at the time seemed harmless due to the cheerful tone they were communicated in, like how he just purchased a gun for protection, or randomly bringing up cases of actresses who had died while a film project was in the works, causing a lot of press upon the film's release, or playmates who had been suddenly murdered, causing chaos within public discourse and a boost in their popularity. The next day, Dorothy had set an appointment to meet up with him on Thursday at 11:30 a.m. to discuss the financial settlement. Snider, after being advised by his PI Goldstein, planned to wire himself in order to capture evidence of Dorothy repeating her promise to make sure he was financially taken care of. But they could not find equipment discreet enough, so that plan was abandoned. By this time, both Dorothy and Bogdanovich had growing suspicions that they were being watched and followed, but neither could pin down concrete proof to validate their intuition. On the 14th of August 1980, Dorothy pulled up to Snider's apartment by the account of the West Los Angeles police and parked her 1967 Mercury on the lot at around 11:45 a.m., but the coroner reported she must have arrived later than that. Goldstein's later statements recorded her arrival to the apartment at 12:30 in the early afternoon, as he himself had called Snider, who was inside with her, to find out how things were going. Snider responded in coded language that all was well. Goldstein made further calls to Snider which went unanswered. No one came in or went out of the apartment till around 5 p.m. when Patty, accompanied by one of Snider's other girlfriends, turned up and noticed Dorothy's car on the lot, as well as Snider's room door locked. When they pressed their ear against the door, they heard no sound. Perhaps they wanted some privacy, and so they left to go ice skating in order to while away more time. When they returned at 7 p.m., Snider's neighbor was also present, and he reported that he'd heard Snider's phone ringing repeatedly and going unanswered. A little before midnight, Goldstein called Patty and asked her to go knock on Snider's door and check on him, but she was reluctant and passed the phone on to Snider's neighbor, who by now was even more concerned. Snider's constantly ringing phone, as well as his German Shepherd who wouldn't stop whining and pacing in the yard by Snider's bedroom window, left him with a growing unease. He knocked, but there was still no answer. By now certain that there must be something off, he shoved the door open, and the vision he witnessed caused him to swing it back shut almost immediately. The two bodies were nude. Dorothy's torso was draped over the bottom corner of the bed, both knees against the carpet floor, her right shoulder drooping off, face down with her hair still vibrant, wrapped perfectly around her face, like she'd chosen to simply rest her head and fallen asleep, now lost in a dream. The shell had pierced through her skull right above her left eye socket, shattering the surrounding bone to mush. Her body was rigid in full rigor mortis. There was a long black trail of ants leading to her face, a bloody fingerprint on her bum and shoulder. The coroner later found semen in her vagina and rectum, corroborating that she had been violently assaulted to visible disfigurement, though unclear if this happened before or after her death. Beside where her head lay was Snider's collection of bondage equipment. Pieces of used and unused tape were littered around her body, and strands of her hair were found in the clutch of Snider's lifeless right hand. He was laying face down at the foot of the bed, with his face blasted away. Clues pointed to the fact that he was on his knees when he pulled the trigger. An outline of the shotgun muzzle burnt on his right cheek, where the shell traveled from to his brain. The impact swung him forward and onto the floor, still holding the weapon. An arc of blood and brain matter splattered on the wall and ceiling. He'd always said he would rather die than go to jail. The two witnesses to the gruesome events of that day in that room were both dead. Had Snider had the intention to carry out a murder, or had he simply wanted to frighten her but gotten intoxicated with the feeling of power he'd missed from her being away from him for so long? Bogdanovich was of the opinion that Snider lured Dorothy to meet with him that day through guilt-tripping and threats of his suicide, or to her own physical well-being, as well as the safety of others around her whom she loved. Perhaps he let slip about the night he'd camped outside her new lover's Bel Air home, letting her know just how close he could always get if he wanted to. Maybe he even bragged about the new gun he'd acquired. Dorothy, Bogdanovich revealed, had been acting quite nervous after a phone call from Snider the day before, which left her shaky and in tears, scanning her surroundings constantly whenever they were out in public, as if expecting a ghoul to suddenly appear from around a corner, or a bomb to go off, glancing at the entrance of a restaurant whenever someone entered, while she dined with Bogdanovich and his two daughters, as well as her baby sister Louise, who was visiting. As long as Snider was around, would she always have to keep looking over her shoulder? Even if she managed to get him deported back to Vancouver, her family back home could become targets instead. Maybe one final meeting would peacefully appease and smooth over the conditions for her freedom. Her purse was found lying open in the middle of the living room floor, with a note inside from Snider groaning about his financial issues and his need for her continued support. There was a wad of cash totaling around $1,100 nestled in there, as well as $400 among Snider's things. Had an argument escalated as they negotiated the sum of the settlement? Had Snider threatened her with the gun in the living room, then walked her to his bedroom at gunpoint to her final resting place? Or had she been taken by surprise when he pointed the weapon directly to her face before taking the shot? The coroner later found that the tip of her left forefinger had been shot off by the impact of the bullets, so it was safe to say that the last thing she had done was to raise her left hand to her face. Dorothy's final offer was apparently a flat rate of $7,500, which was half of her total assets after taxes, she claimed. Not nearly enough to fund Snider's love of luxury and lavishness. Was $1,100 found in her purse the first installment? Goldstein arrived to the crime scene before the police and spent an unspecified amount of time there before phoning the police. Then he made a call to Hefner at the Playboy mansion to alert them that Dorothy and Snider were dead. Several staff members had been trying to phone her with no success all day. Murder-suicide, Hefner replied without being told. His fear was confirmed. He appeared as pale as a ghost as all blood drained from his face, his secretary recalled. The same secretary also alleged that later that night, Hefner would ask her to arrange for him a date with the new girl who had just arrived at the mansion. When Hefner made the gruesome announcement to his guests at the game house following his confirmation call to the authorities, there were shrieks of horror and disbelief. He would immediately contact Bogdanovich, who made no sound. I was afraid he'd gone into shock or something. I called the house under another number and a male friend was there to make sure he was all right. He was completely overcome. Snider's body was returned to Vancouver, far away from the flashing lights and grandeur of Hollywood, while Dorothy's entire family flew down to Los Angeles for her burial service at Westwood Memorial Park, the same cemetery Marilyn Monroe was also laid to rest. Bogdanovich had arranged her cremation 5 days after her body was discovered, and the urn containing her ashes were placed into a casket. All attendants flocked to Bogdanovich's home following the ceremony to keep each other company and make sense of grief in quiet conversations and stretches of silence. It was decided that no one would give statements to the press until after the release of They All Laughed. Playboy featured half-naked pictures of her in its December issue alongside Bo Derek and Brooke Shields with the titles Sex Stars of 1980 and caption Cut short what seasoned star watchers predicted was sure to be an outstanding film career. Even after her death, the exploitation would not cease as newspapers, magazines, TV, and movie screens took advantage of the buzz created by her violent demise for attention. Her personal objects as well as information about her life and murder were peddled by desperate associates to make a quick buck from the press. A grieving Bogdanovich who prided himself as a feminist put a lot of blame on Hefner for Dorothy's demise. The two publicly slandered each other in the public eye, with Bogdanovich claiming Dorothy confided in him that Hefner raped her on the first night she spent in his house, and that she was only willing to marry Snider, the man who would go on to take her life, in order to shield herself from the gross sexual advances of the wolves at the Playboy mansion. Hefner got his lawyers involved and ensured the word rape was erased from the manuscript of Bogdanovich's biography on Dorothy before publishing. Hefner, in his own defense, explained, "Dorothy absolutely adored me and I adored her. In my relationship with her, I gave a great deal and took very little. She, along the way, married a creepy guy who followed her from Canada. And if there's one thing you can say about Dorothy, it's that she had very bad taste in men. She, in fact, had a self-esteem problem and seemed to seek out these men. Her relationship with Peter was really just a next-level variation of her relationship with Snider, and the saddest thing that has happened since her death is that he has done the same thing Snider did. He's tried to possess her in the same way." He in turn accused Bogdanovich in a press conference of being a child predator who groomed the late star's underage sibling as a pathological replacement. Being 29 years older, Bogdanovich was 41 and Louise 12 the year they'd first met, the same year Dorothy was laid to rest. To support his accusation before flashing cameras, Hefner called up on stage diesel mechanic Burl Eldridge, who had been married to Nellie, Dorothy's mother, for 3 months before the tragic incident. Eldridge claimed Bogdanovich made a habit of visiting Vancouver following the burial and taken Louise away on trips to Bayshore Inn, where they shared a room and a bed, just the two of them, for many weekends. That Bogdanovich sponsored Louise's cosmetic jawbone reconstruction so she could look more like Dorothy. That Bogdanovich ruined his marriage to Nellie by lavishing her with expensive gifts which he himself could not afford to compete with. Louise and Nellie heard about Hefner's press conference while they were staying with Bogdanovich at his home on Copa de Oro Drive for Louise's Easter vacation from the 11th grade. 48 hours later, they filed a $5 million slander suit against Hefner and Eldridge, a suit ultimately settled outside of court, with their representing lawyer stating that Bogdanovich's only relationship to the two was no more than a friend of the family. Bogdanovich would go on to wed Louise in 1988 when she turned 20, the exact age he'd lost Dorothy. When they tied the knot, he was 49 years old. Though controversial, their relationship, he claimed, was born out of mutual grief over the loss of a personality they'd both loved. Their marriage lasted a total of 13 years before a divorce in 2001. It seemed the ambitions of three male figures in Dorothy's life were laid to rest alongside her. Snider's lust for wealth and fame, Hefner's goal of manufacturing a superstar, and Bogdanovich's longing for the perfect model object to love. The last letter Nellie, her mother, sent to her would go unread, as by the time it was discovered, Dorothy was already gone. Dear sweetheart, thank you for your nice letter, Dorothy. I love you. I hope Paul leaves you with some money. Please, Dorothy, if you're broke, I'll send you money. We'll always be here to help you. You know that, don't you? Listen good to your lawyer, ask him questions, because Paul has nothing to lose anymore. I know you're getting a lot of surprises, darling, and hurt feelings. He's going to ask you to support him, yet ask your lawyer your rights, okay? And also ask your lawyer what to expect from Paul and how to stop him from draining you completely. Be strong, darling. I know you'll come through with flying colors. I told Louise she could come round on the 10th of August. She's happy. I wish, darling, that I could have stopped you from all that hurt, but I could not. God knows why. All I know is we all love you and are here to help. Mom.